Now, Mormons have all sorts of ways of kind of working around that type of conclusion, right? So it's like, oh, well, you didn't pray the right way, that wasn't God who answered your question, you weren't sincere, right? The problem with this particular situation, I already knew Dean. I knew him well, and I knew he was a sincere guy. He was a bright guy. So it was really hard for me at that point to just discount what Dean was telling me. I really believed what he was telling me. And that led me down an interesting path, and that all coincided with me being in graduate school. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with sociology. Sociology is social science, right? We take a very specific scientific approach to studying social life. And I was being taught to study social life from a scientific perspective. We gather data, we evaluate hypotheses, we test theories. So I was being taught to think about the world in a different way, which is basically an epistemology, a way of knowing, right? So I was being taught that at the same time that this happened with Dean. I started my graduate work in 2001 at the University of Cincinnati, and within a year, it was over. Okay. And really what did it is I realized that epistemology of praying to God to learn truth isn't very good. It's pretty bad, right? And so I started to apply my newfound epistemology of empiricism to my religion, and pretty quickly I started to learn things like Joseph Smith's affair and his many wives, and it just fell apart for me, right? I became an atheist shortly thereafter, and actually now identify as basically an atheist and a humanist, right? So, see them both. In large part, this is because of the sociology of religion and what it actually did for me. So all of this is to set up kind of the book and where I'm going to go today. And how long do I have? What's my time?
We try and let out at 1:30, and hopefully you'll have a little time for questions.
Yeah, we should be. All right. So what is the sociology of religion? Any of you familiar with this guy, Daniel Dennett? Maybe a few, right? Is he? I'll have to come see that one. So he wrote a book a few years ago called Breaking the Spell. Anybody read Breaking the Spell? A few, right? In that book, and it's kind of interesting, he's a philosopher, right? In that book, he makes this argument that I think is really interesting in a certain way. He makes the argument that religions, not all religions, but many religions make truth claims. And if that's the case, if they make truth claims, then evaluating those claims from a scientific perspective should be perfectly legitimate. That there should be no aspect of religion that should be off limits, right? And I'll give you an example, right? How many of you have heard of intercessory prayer? We know what this is. So this is praying for other people, right? And usually it's done to heal them, right? To help them in some way. Do any of you know that we've actually assessed the validity of intercessory prayer? And what did we find?
It's true. It's true.
Okay, so here's a study, right? And I'm just going to describe the study because I think this is fascinating, and this is precisely the point that Daniel Dennett was making. We should evaluate these claims. If religious people say that intercessory prayer works, let's test it. So some enterprising scientists got together, they got a $6 million grant. So a big grant, right? And they got a whole bunch of physicians to help them in this study. Right? And what they did, they went to several different hospitals in New England, right on the coast, and they started to enroll people into the study. Okay? The people who were going to be involved in the study, the patients, were all going in for open heart surgery. It's a legit surgery, right? We've got a serious issue. And as they would come in, they were assigned to one of 3 different conditions. Okay? And they were told, so they were saying, we want you to be in the study. Will you be in the study? Yes. Okay, here are your different conditions. One group, they just invited them to be in the study and said, here's what the study's about. We're not going to do anything for you. I mean, other than the medical care, you're just in the study. They're the control group, right? Another group, they bring them in and say, well, we want to pray for you. Is it okay if we pray for you? Yes. And they actually did pray for you. They hired a bunch of nuns in Missouri to pray for them. Okay? So they did. I mean, legitimately, that's what they did. So they told them, we're going to pray for you, and they prayed for them, right? The third group, they prayed for them. Right? But didn't tell them. Okay? So they're praying for him, but not telling him. And again, it's the same nuns praying for these people. So here's the question. Which group has the worst outcomes? The control group would get nothing. The group that was told we're going to pray for you and they did, or the group that was not told they were going to be prayed for, and they were prayed for. Control group?
Center group. No, the center group that told that they were going to get prayed for.
The one they were told they were going to pray for, they had the worst outcomes. They took longer to recover and were statistically more likely to die.
Anxiety.
That's actually what they attributed to.
Say that
So the group that was told, we're going to pray for you, and they did, they had worse, so it took longer to recover, and they were statistically more likely to die.
What about the third?
That's a good question, right? Third group was no different from the control group. So the other two groups, exactly the same outcomes.
How big was the negative effect?
It was statistically significant, but if you know stats, it was not huge, right? So as far as effect sizes, it wasn't particularly large.
Statistically significant means at least 5% difference?
It was about a 3% difference, actually. So it was like 2.6 to 3%, if I remember the study exactly. And if you want, you can get my email address, I'll send you the study, right? Yeah.
Do you remember who did the study? Was it Teller?
No, this wasn't Teller. No, this was actually a group of PhDs and MDs, right? And the list of authors on that study is like 20 people. I mean, it was huge, right? And actually, they hemmed and hawed about submitting the study for publication for a long time because it was not what they were hoping to find, right? What did they ultimately attribute it to? Well, when somebody says, I'm going to pray for you, makes it seem really serious, doesn't it? And that's what they ultimately concluded. They're like, well, we told them we were going to pray for him. They got worried, right? So Daniel Dennett says we should study every aspect of religion scientifically. What he doesn't realize, because he's a philosopher, is that we're already doing that, right? Turns out sociologists have been studying all sorts of aspects of religion for decades, but many of those findings are just tucked away in peer-reviewed journals. And I don't know how many scientists we have in here, academics, scholars. How many of you read peer-reviewed journals? Familiar with them, right? So this is where we publish original academic research. It goes in these peer-reviewed journals, right? Nobody reads these except academics. We write for each other, basically, right? Which is kind of silly. The weird thing is, a lot of the sociologists who study religion are religious. So when they find things that aren't necessarily all that favorable towards the religious, they publish them, and then they just hide them, and they never mention them. So as I started to study the sociology of religion, imagine my eyes opening up. Like, what? We've known this? And if we get to some of the stuff, I'm going to shoot. We've known some of these things for 50, 60 years, but they're just in these journals, and no one talks about them, right? So the point of my book was basically to say, we know a lot of stuff about religion already. Here it is in an easily digestible format so you can know it too. Right? And like I said, I'm a data guy. This is filled with charts and figures. You're going to see some of them today. So basically, the approach of the book. Here's what I'm doing. Right? I take the religious. Right? So the religious figure very prominently in this. I take the religious and I break them in the U.S. up into 3 groups. Okay? So one group is liberally religious people. Right? And this would actually include your Unitarians, but people like Eugene Robinson, who was an Episcopalian. Right? So these are liberally religious. What that means, right, is that they're not literalists when it comes to Scripture. And they also accept science, right? So we have large groups of people in the U.S. who are liberal in their religious views. We have moderates, people in the middle, people like John Roberts, who's the Supreme Court Chief Justice, right? It's a Catholic. They accept some science, they reject other science, right? They're kind of mixed in the middle. And then we have people like who is an evangelical Protestant. She is what we would term a fundamentalist. Okay? Religious fundamentalists are liberalists. They believe whatever the Bible says happened. So when we talk about a Noah's Ark, there was a Noah's Ark for them. Okay? They also tend to be black and white thinkers. There is truth and there is everything else. And if you are not part of my truth, I reject it. I reject you. I reject everything about you. This is why they're unwilling to compromise. Because if they compromise, who are they compromising with? See? So you can't compromise as a fundamentalist, right? Fun little trivia question here. What percentage of Americans are fundamentalists?
Yeah,
It is too many, but 30 to 33%. Almost 1 in 3 Americans are religious fundamentalists still today. That number's ticking down slowly, but it's still pretty high. Maybe not in Clearwater, right? But certainly rural Florida, absolutely it is, right? And the South is very fundamentalist, okay? I have a question, yeah.
Have you heard about the survey that's made about happiness? What country is the happiness?
Yeah, I covered it in the book too, right? So there's a whole chapter on religion and happiness. All right, so I take those 3 groups, so it's a good stuff. I take those 3 groups and I compare them to the non-religious, people like Brad Pitt, who's not religious, right? And I compare them on a whole variety of different topics. We'll cover a few of them today. But to make this broader than just the US, and whenever it's US data, I've got a US flag. Whenever, to make it broader, I also do international data. Problem is, internationally, we can't break religion down the same way, right? Because the fundamentalist thing doesn't work as well. So I use a slightly different question, but this is another big data set, where they asked about importance of religion. How important is religion to you? And it ranges from very important to rather to not very to not at all important, and I use that distinction. Okay? And whenever I do that, I've got world data there. The data sets that I use, they're publicly available. Some of the best data, if you're into data, right, you can download all of these and you can actually verify all my stats. That's why I did this. I chose the best data sets for this, right? All right, so here's what we're going to do in our remaining time. Hopefully we can go fast. I'm going to let you choose which topic you want me to talk about. I've pulled 5 chapters out of the book. I think they're kind of interesting, right? And we're going to have a vote. And whichever one gets the most votes, that's what we'll talk about. If we have time, we can do a second one. But if you have any questions at any point, you can also pull. So here are the actual chapter headings, right? And I'll just kind of tell you what we've got. So first one, all demons are from Hollywood. How media created the possession fad. Okay, so it's a fun one. Got some gory pictures in there. Another one, multiply and replenish the pews. Why religions encourage procreation. Big families, right? 15, if you're humble and you know it, you're probably religious. This is religion and arrogance, right? So we can talk about religion and pride. 17, love your neighbor except when he's, which is not exactly how that passage goes. This is about religion and prejudice, and this is one of the more interesting ones, because we've known about this for a long time. And 24, sleeping on Sunday, religion and health. Okay. So we'll just go through, and like I said, you can pick whichever one you want. We've got all this prepared, right? And we'll do whatever one we want, and then we can kind of jump through. How many are interested in 8? No one. Don't care about the one. All right. 11. How many are interested in religious procreation? 2, 3. How about if you're humble and you know it, religion and arrogance? Got a few more there. Okay. And religion and prejudice? That's my winner. Everybody likes that one. 24, sleeping on Sunday. Look at you. Okay, so what we'll probably do, we'll do religion and prejudice first, and then we'll go back and do religion and arrogance if we've got time. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just go down this. Okay. Prejudice. So, just to clarify, so people have this clear going into it, sociologists obviously draw a very clear distinction between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is when you think about a group of people in a very specific way. You may express that verbally, but you don't necessarily treat them differently. Treating them different is discrimination. Okay, so we draw that distinction. We're really primarily focused on prejudice with this. A lot of my research is actually focused on experienced discrimination by the non-religious. So I've actually done research on that, and I can talk about that too, but we're focused on prejudice. Okay? So here's the interesting thing about prejudice, right? Religions are groups. Okay? And this is kind of an important thing to talk about. So when I talk about a religion, what do I really mean? The classic definition in sociology, and there are actually a couple of others, but this is the one that I like, is religions are collective beliefs regarding the supernatural. Now, UUH gets a little fuzzy there. It's kind of like, I get that, right? But for most religions, this holds, right? Now, think about the 2 parts that I've included in it. Collective beliefs, supernatural. Supernatural, this is above or beyond nature. This is like gods or spirits, things like that, right? Why collective beliefs? Collective means more than one, right? Well, let me give you an example. If I suddenly said, I'm Jesus Christ, what do you think I am?
No.
I'm crazy. But if I showed up with 50,000 followers and they all believed I was Jesus Christ, now what do I have? Now I have a religion. So the distinction between crazy and religion is collective. If you have followers, suddenly you've got a religion, right? So religions, by their very nature, are groups. They're collective, right? But the amazing thing about groups, and we've known this for a very long time, is that groups are divisive. When someone belongs to your same group, you like them better just because they belong to your group. And when someone's in your out-group, you actually like them less just because they're in your out-group. This is basic social psychology we've known for a long time. Let me illustrate this. We'll do a fun little thought experiment, right? So we're going to do a thought experiment. What I want you to do is think of someone, right, who falls out of your kind of political group, right? Maybe someone like Rush Limbaugh, who said in 1994, women should not be allowed on juries where the accused is a stud, and by stud he means rapist. Okay? So, when we think about people in our political outgroups, what words come to mind? Now try somebody who's in a religious outgroup, and I'm guessing this holds for most of you, right? Someone like Pat Robertson, who had this beauty to say, I know this is painful for the ladies to hear, but if you get married, you have accepted the headship of a man, your husband. The husband is the head of the wife, and that's the way that it is, period. And yes, he's flipping you off there. I don't know if you can see that, but he is. Again, what words come to mind? Now, we've got one final one. What about somebody who falls into both of those outgroups? Okay, maybe somebody like Todd Aiken, who said this just last year. First of all, from what I understand from doctors, pregnancy from rape is really rare. If it's a legitimate rape, right, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down. What words come to mind? Okay, we tend not to like them, and largely it's because they're in our outgroup. So we can actually illustrate this graphically. I do this with my students because I like pictures. Pictures help, right? So graphically, let's put you in the middle. And yes, that's an androgynous you because I'm covering both sexes, right? So we're putting you in the middle. And if we think about people who share your political views, okay, and then people who share your religious or non-religious views, those people right here, right, they're a lot like us. And then, of course, there are the people who don't share either of those, and of course, they're just assholes. But that's still right? The weird thing about this, right, the people who are just like us, we tend to like them the most, right? Why do you think that is? Why do we like people who share our religious, political views?
They validate us.
They validate us, right? If you've ever spent time around people who disagree with you politically or religiously, isn't it kind of, it's awkward, it's time-consuming, it's painful, because you're constantly kind of watching what you're saying or debating things. It gets old really quick. But if we can surround ourselves with people who are just like us, we're valuable. We like this, right? Now there's a really weird twist to all of this, and I'll get your question in just one second, right? So there's a really weird twist. So here's the really interesting thing. The non-religious are actually still, despite all of what I've just said, are the most accepting of the people in their outgroups.
Are most accepting of what?
Of people in their outgroups. The non-religious are the most accepting of all of the others. And we can actually see this. Here's an interesting one, right? Non-religious people are just as likely to vote for a Catholic for president as are Protestants. They're less likely than Catholics, but of course they're Catholics, right? They're just as likely to vote for a Protestant as are Catholics. Yet they're non-religious. It's kind of weird, right? I had a question. You want to throw it?
Sort of comment.
Sure.
Just from a human standpoint, we like people who are like us because it's biologically protective of us. We fear people who are unlike us, so I think we're always battling against that as well as the social and psychological aspect.
Absolutely. Right. And there's pretty good biological evidence to support that we tend to prefer people who look like us. Yeah, absolutely. Got a question there and another one here. Yeah.
Right, or maybe a comment.
Sure.
I think maybe it's because the non-religious are a minority in the same way that left-handed tennis players have a better outcome because their opponents are less familiar with their style. And the way you might, that a black person might say, some of my best friends are white people.
Sure. It could be that, but I'm going to argue that there's actually something else going on, right? And it's interesting, but we've got a couple more comments. Trying to keep track of time. So we'll get a couple more and then we'll move on.
You originally, earlier said
Yeah.
a third are fundamentalists of the U.S. population.
Yes.
But you didn't say how many were non-religious.
Oh, that's a good question. Does anybody know what percentage are now non-religious? 20%. Right. As of 2012, it's 20%. In 1990, it was 7%.
So 80% is the outgroup.
Yes, for them, right? Which actually, I mean, it gets really fuzzy, right? And are we okay with a quick tangent? Is that okay? I'll do a quick tangent. So that's a really, this gets tricky for sociologists because of how we try and measure these things, right? This is based on survey responses when we ask people, what is your religion, if any, right? 20% today will say, I don't have one, right? And that's shifted over time. But we can ask other questions. So another one that we often ask, which I think is interesting as well, is how often do you go to church? So 20% of Americans say they're non-religious, roughly 80%. It's actually closer to 75 because 5% just won't answer the question. 75% say they have a religious affiliation. What percentage of Americans go to church on a weekly basis?
40?
Somebody said it. Somebody said 40, right? Consistently, since about the 1960s, it's been about 40 to 44% of Americans say, I go to church roughly once a week. But, do you think that number's accurate?
You think what?
Do you think the number's accurate? Do you think it's actually 40%? It is self-reported, so a couple of sociologists said, and the funny part is, the guy who did this, Kirk Hadaway, he works for the Methodist Church. He's like, if that number were accurate, we'd need double the number of churches we have. So he decided to go check it, right? He and a couple of other researchers, they went to a couple of small towns, one in Ohio, one in Georgia. They gave the same survey question a week before, and they got the 40% response. Then they went to the actual churches the next week, and they counted. And what do you think they found?
23%.
It's 20 to 22%. Yeah, 20 to 20%. So roughly 1 in 5 Americans are actually in church every week. So the reason why I mentioned that, right? 20% are non-religious, but only 20% are going to church. That leaves a big window in the middle. What are all those people? Right? It's kind of weird. They say that I'm religious, and well, really? Okay, sure. We'll accept that. Got a couple of other questions, and then we do have to move on from cash. Yeah.
In that survey, where did Unitarian Universalists come down? Non-religious, or?
Oh, no,
did
they would typically be
be
considered
in the
religious.
80%.
Yeah, they'd be part of the
They're
80%.
secular humanists, most of us.
They would be so you can actually report humanist. I've worked with these big data sets. They get categorized as non-religious. So if you say your religion is humanist, right, which is not really a religion, but if you say that, you get categorized as non-religious.
All right.
Yeah. Other question, and I saw one other, and then two others. Yeah, go for it.
I think the 80% you're talking about there, they are people who theology doesn't affect their life, but they're caught up in this theological game that's played in society. So you either have to go along with it, or you have to object to it. And I think the more you object to it, the more you have to become defensive, and the more you start learning about the things that are impacting, which is the theology.
Yeah, certainly some of the theology is important, right? But for many, I think you're probably right that it's not that important. We've got another one here, one more there.
I was thinking about your statement up there, and it reminds me of a study that was done on folks that looked at a picture of a cat, and the picture looked, subsequent pictures of the cat looked less and less and less like a cat, till pretty soon it was just a couple of vague lines. Religious people saw the cat longer than any other group.
Sure. Yeah.
And I found religious people are the least likely to question their own thoughts and theories.
Yep, I've got that data in the book. There's a great chart in there that actually literally shows what percentage ever doubt and question.
Ryan, we're running short of time.
I know, so
we
we gotta move on. Is that okay? I know.
Yeah.
So let's actually look at the data, because I've got data for this, right? And I apologize, I know these numbers are small, it's a little far away, but I'll kind of read out what we're looking at, right? So this first set of figures, this is US data. It's not going to surprise anybody. We'll get the more surprising data here in just a second. This is a question about homosexuality. Okay, this is US data. And what we have, this first one, right, is the percentage of Americans, right? And we're breaking this out by the religious groups that I just mentioned. So over here, this is the fundamentalists, right, the blue line, and the green line is the non-religious. Orange is the moderates, and that kind of yellowy line is the liberals, religious liberals, not political, but religious liberals. The question is, what percentage oppose or strongly oppose homosexual marriage? Okay, and like I said, I don't think that's particularly surprising. 61% of religious fundamentalists in the U.S. today say no, they shouldn't be allowed to marry. That's about 20% for the non-religious. And of course, the liberals, it's about 1 in 3. And we've seen this shift over time. So this is, for everybody, the percentage who oppose is going down, right? The next one, and I think this is, in some ways it's a more interesting question. This is the percentage who think that homosexual sex is always wrong. Now the other options, right, are sometimes wrong or not wrong at all. 70% of religious fundamentalists in the U.S. say homosexual sex is always wrong. So is always wrong. It's wrong, right? So we see these numbers. Now, like I said, I don't think this is all surprising. We kind of know this, right? Let's try this next step, which I think is kind of interesting. So this next set of figures, you're seeing a very similar pattern, right? It's asking a very different question. So the question is kind of set up in a weird way. It basically says, okay, I'm going to give you a group of people, and I want you to tell me whether or not you think they should be allowed to speak in public. Okay? So that's the question. And then the response is, yes, I think they should be allowed, or no, they should not be allowed. And we've got 4 different groups that we're going to look at here. This first one, and again, this is the same breakdown. This is fundamentalists, moderates, liberals, and non-religious. The percentage who say atheists should not be allowed to speak in public. 38% of religious fundamentalists say no. They shouldn't even be allowed to speak, which would include me. I shouldn't be doing this, according to them, right? This drops down to 10% for the non-religious. Of course, the liberal religious is 18%. So that's atheists. Next one over, this is communists.
What?
Communists. Communists should not be allowed to speak. That jumps up to 50%. Say no, they shouldn't be allowed to speak. Okay? Next one over, homosexuals. 1 in 4 religious fundamentalists in the U.S. say they shouldn't be allowed to speak. This is prejudice. This is prejudice. Okay? And then my last one. And this one's it's a tricky one. It's a little weird, right? This is the percentage who say that a racist should not be allowed to speak. Okay? And like I said, this one's a little bit weird, because think about this, right? What have I just said about the non-religious and the liberally religious? They're the most tolerant. What have they just said here? They're also the most likely to allow a racist to speak. But racism is bad. Why would they be allowing a racist to speak? Freedom of speech, right? They may disagree with you vehemently, but they'll still let you speak. You can say whatever racist thing you want. That's fine. We don't agree with you, but we'll let you say it. And to support this, let me show you this last set of data. So this is my last kind of data on this topic. We'll see how we're doing here. So this is a slightly different question. This question asks, right, how comfortable would you be with one of your close relatives marrying someone who is blank? This first one is the percentage who oppose or strongly oppose a close relative marrying someone who is black. Okay? And this is just whites. This is just whites in the U.S. 50% of religious fundamentalists say no. They shouldn't marry someone who's black. Liberal religious, still 42%. Drops down to 22% for the non-religious. The non-religious are the most accepting of racial groups. Right? Second one, so this one over here, same question, but instead of black, Jewish. Almost 1 in 4 religious fundamentalists in the U.S. say, no, I would not be okay with a close relative marrying someone who's Jewish. Okay? That's prejudice right there. That's what we're looking at, right? And what we see is a very clear relationship between religiosity and prejudice. Okay? And of course, what this leads me to conclude, we'll wrap this up here, surprise, surprise, religious fundamentalists in the U.S. are more likely to hate or at least dislike blacks, Jews, homosexuals, atheists, and communists. And yes, Pete Seeger is a communist. Right? The non-religious are the most accepting of all of these, and just to throw this other one in, fundamentalists are also the most likely to beat their wives and their kids. And yes, we have data to back that up. We know that. And we've known this for a long time. So I'm going to wrap up this last one. So here's the fun thing. Anybody want to guess how long we've known that religious fundamentalists are the most prejudiced in the U.S.? Since 1954. We've known this since before I was born, right? Since 1954. It was actually a psychologist who figured this out. His name was Gordon Allport, a very famous social psychologist, right? He figured this out in the 1950s, but he did something just brilliant to cover this up. Okay? He was so disturbed by this because he personally was very religious. He was a Catholic, right? He was so disturbed by this that he created a new way to measure religion just to cover this up. Here's what he did. He created a scale with a bunch of questions in it. And what it did is it separated people out based on whether he thought they were mature in their religion or immature in their religion. And it turns out that scale actually correlates quite well with prejudice. So suddenly Gordon Allport could say, well, I'm mature in my religion and therefore I'm not prejudiced. It's those immature religious people who are the prejudiced religious ones, and of course he completely neglects the non-religious, who are the least prejudiced of the whole bunch. Anyway, so that wraps up the prejudice, and I think I'm out of time. I think we have a lot of questions, and I'm happy to stay as long as we want. So.
Two questions.
Two questions. We have a question here and one over there.
Somebody new.
They're not.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is whether my classes, if they're online, they're not. UT hasn't quite got them. So I've given this presentation to a couple of other groups, and they've put it on.
Somebody else.
Right. So, and I don't know if he's going to put. Are you going to put this online? Who's filming?
He's asking.
You going to
I'm
put this
sorry.
online? Yes. No.
Are you going to put that online?
Probably not the whole thing, but parts of it, yeah.
So but not all of them are. I cover a lot of this in my sociology religion class, right? And I try and be engaging there too. Or you can just get the book of work too. Yeah.
Yes. In order to be considered a religion, you need to believe in a supernatural force in the universe.
Something supernatural by that definition. It gets fudgy. Unitarian Universalists, like I said, are in that gray area.
So where is it religion believe in some supernatural force? Or some of them atheists?
Well, every person in a religion? Or some religions themselves.
Like this church, for example, Unitarian Church. Is this church considered a religion?
Yes, it is.
There's many atheists in this church, including me.
Right.
So what do we believe? We say worship. Who are we worshiping?
It's a great question, right? And like I said, these boundaries are a little bit fuzzy, right? Another quick tangent, which I think is kind of interesting. Does anybody know what % of atheists go to church every week?
Probably all the Unitarian
Across the U.S., 1% of atheists are in church every single week. And here's the other, you can flip that around and say what percentage of people in church are atheists. It's also 1%.
In this church, it's a lot more.
In this church, it is a lot more, right? Why might that be the case that 1% of atheists are in church every week?
community.
How do we get rid of these idiots?
Oh, sorry. We'll come right back to that. Most of them are actually married to somebody who's religious. So for the atheists, they're actually going to maintain family harmony. We can actually see that in the data, right? Which is kind of interesting. How do we get rid of these idiots? I didn't say that, you said that. Though, technically, there's a chapter in there on intelligence. Guess what happens with intelligence? Education. Education's in there too. Religious fundamentalists are actually the least intelligent of the bunch.
Yeah.
And that's borne out in the data. Lots of studies have found this, right? How do we get rid of them? Education is very effective, actually. Education is probably the best tool. However, here's the problem. Religious fundamentalists, not all of them, but many of them, oppose higher education. They oppose it because they literally, and they teach this, it's amazing, they teach that Satan works at universities. Apparently that's me. Satan. Because they know that it's such an effective way of reducing orthodoxy in belief and religious fundamentalism. So education's our best tool, however, we got to get them in the door, and that's pretty hard. Yeah?
I'm just curious, over the last 60 years, since the 50s, with the studies, does it show a tendency for more fundamentalists, less fundamentalists, more atheists, less atheists?
Oh, change over time.
Yeah, how
Sure.
has it changed over the last 60 years?
Fundamentalism has been going down, right? So that's kind of nice, right? Fundamentalism is going down. The non-religious has certainly been going up. There's no question about that. I published a study in 2009, right, where we estimated the number of people in the U.S., so trying to give an absolute number to this, the number of people in the U.S. who are becoming non-religious every year. It's about 620,000. Okay? The fastest growing religious group in the U.S. is actually the non-religious, and it's largely at the expense of liberally religious people and moderates. Fundamentalists are not losing as many as you would think, right? However, Southern Baptists have finally, in the last 3 years, started to decline in numbers. So Southern Baptists are actually going down, right? That's recent, that's just in the last few years. So the trajectory over time, fundamentalism has been going down slowly, very, very slowly, but the main line, which we would call the liberals here and the moderates, they've been getting clobbered, right? Since the 1960s, if you look at the data, it's remarkable, right? Mainline religions, or the liberally religious, they're aging. So you see the average age of people who identify that way is going up and up and up, and they're not retaining their kids. And as a result, I mean, you literally, and it sounds terrible to say this, they're dying.
Just one quick comment on the Southern Baptist remark. I'm the son of a Southern Baptist minister. I think one of the reasons the Southern Baptists are going, or seem to be declining, is that the liberal Southern Baptists, which my father was, are disassociating themselves with the Southern Baptist Convention. So the fundamentalists are not necessarily declining in the Southern Baptists. The moderate, the conservatives are not necessarily declining. It's the liberal Southern Baptists that have hung on for a long time because that's the way they always were. They're disassociating with themselves.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're out of time. I'm happy to stick around, and I'm going to lunch afterwards. So.
Yeah, I'm trying to stick around. Thank you very much.